Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of the KSP2 Low Mass Challenge series. This video is going to feature a low mass mission to Eve. This is a challenge that the channel took on in KSP1, but in KSP2 it's going to pose a different challenge involving more complexity and more mass. Between KSP1 and KSP2, a lot of little things have changed, some making it more difficult, some making it less, but there's 3 significant things that have changed, all pushing this in the direction of being a more difficult challenge. The first major thing that's changed is the lack of propeller engines available. Being able to push using the atmosphere is pretty close to a free lunch relative to reactive engines where we're going to have to bring all of our propellant with us. The second significant difference is going to compound with the first one. The terrain on Eve has changed, and the highest mountains are now considerably lower elevation than they were in KSP1. We are going to have to use rocket engines to push through all this atmosphere, and now we have more of the lowest, thickest levels of atmosphere to go through. The last big factor that's changed here is reentry heating. Reentry heating in KSP2 has become significantly more intense. Particularly with landing on Eve, this was a big design factor. In KSP1, the approach I used was just to use wings to stay in the upper atmosphere until I slowed down enough to safely re-enter the lower atmosphere. This just isn't enough to avoid overheating in KSP2. A big heat shield is therefore at the front of this. It was a big design factor, it's a significant amount of mass added, and a significant amount of drag added to the mission as well. It is, however, as small and as sleek as I could make it. I tried a lot of different heat shield designs before settling on this as the one that added the least mass to the mission. Our total mass on launch, counting our fearless pilot Bill, comes out to 27 metric tons and 972 kilograms. The first stage of our ascent uses 2 Rapier engines on air-breathing mode. About 1.5 would have been enough, but half an engine doesn't exist, and 1 wasn't enough. As we get towards the maximum airspeed that's possible with the air-breathing engines, we're first going to turn on the Dart engine from the next stage, and then briefly swap the Rapiers to closed cycle mode to burn off the remainder of their fuel. As with the previous installment in the low mass series, all field transfer here are done by pausing and setting up manual field transfers. Automatic field transfer remains something that is a big item on the wish list. After detaching the first stage, we're down to about 13.8 tons. This means that we've already used about half of the mass we launched with here. Mass is the currency we have to work with in this mission. At each milestone, we'll get a report of how much mass is remaining left to work with. The Aerospike engine on the next stage is now going to do all of the work in getting us into space and then into a low Kerbin orbit. This is far from the best engine for this particular maneuver. We're using it now because we need the Aerospike later for when we get to Eve. Reusing engines for multiple maneuvers is almost always better than adding an engine to have ideal performance for each one. Adding mass is always bad, and adding dry mass is particularly bad. Once the periapsis of our orbit is over 70 kilometers, we are fully in space. Our mass now is down to 12 tons, 22 kilograms. We do, however, have some empty fuel tanks to discard. We're going to dine on a free lunch here by throwing it behind us and getting some extra impulse. After detaching the fuel tank, our usable mass in low Kerbin orbit is 11 tons, 819 kilograms. We're also detaching a small 90 kilogram module here. This, however, is going to be used again towards the end of the mission, so it will continue to be included in the reports throughout of usable mass. The 3 solar panels being deployed here are going to provide electricity to the ion engine that's going to do all of the interplanetary maneuvers in this mission. The ion engine is one of my favorite things to work with in KSP. A kind of near-future rendition of an engine that seems like science fiction but already exists in reality and already has been used on spacecraft. The engine we have available to us in KSP2 has a lot less thrust than it did in KSP1. It still has a lot more thrust than the ion engines that we have in reality, but the technology behind this is improving rapidly, and I'm confident we'll get there. Due to the low thrust of this engine, it takes us a long time to get from a low Kerbin orbit to an elliptical Kerbin orbit. The maneuver is split into many separate burns, each done at our periapsis for efficiency. This maneuver could have been done significantly more quickly in terms of mission time without too much loss in efficiency, but I really wanted to stick with low mass as the single metric of performance. We are going to be using a sequence of gravity assists to get from Kerbin to Eve. This will save us delta V, but it's not just about saving delta V in this mission. Due to the low thrust of the ion engine, our thrust-to-weight ratio is low enough that the gap between an elliptical Kerbin orbit and a Kerbin-Eve transfer orbit is big enough that we can't do it in a single maneuver. The gravity assists then are not just about saving a little bit of mass, it's an essential part of using this kind of propulsion. The sequence of gravity assists consist of an assist off the moon as we eject from Kerbin the first time, and then 2 additional rendezvous with Kerbin, one of whom also has a Mooner assist in it. The key concept for making sure these additional rendezvous with Kerbin happen is resonance. We achieve a resonant orbit with Kerbin by making sure that the ratio between the period of our orbit and the period of Kerbin's orbit is a rational number, and a rational number where the numerator and denominator are not too high of a number. Since a rational number is a ratio of 2 integers, this means that after we travel an integer number of full orbits and Kerbin travels an integer number of full orbits, we have both ended right back up at our starting point and will be there at the same time. Upon arriving at Eve, we have a fairly significant maneuver to do to capture in an elliptical Eve orbit. Due to the intense heating model in KSP2, particularly on Eve, almost none of this can be done with aerobraking. As a result, the resulting maneuver with the ion engine is the longest single interrupted burn in this mission at 4 hours and 24 minutes. Once captured in an elliptical Eve orbit, we have many orbits to work with, and we can let aerobraking very slowly bring us down to a low Eve orbit. After arriving in low Eve orbit, our usable mass remaining will be 11 tons, 408 kilograms. This means that we used about 58% of the mass on the runway on Kerbin to get to low Kerbin orbit, and then about 5% of the mass in low Kerbin orbit to get to low Eve orbit. This is a great example of the efficiency of ion engines and the effectiveness of gravity assists. We are going to leave the 505 kilogram ion craft in low Eve orbit and land the Eve orbiter, now with the heat shield on the front. As mentioned at the beginning, in KSP2, the mountains on Eve are significantly shorter than they were in KSP1, capping out at around 2.6 kilometers instead of about 8.5 kilometers. It is, however, still very important to land on one of these mountains. Rocket engines work less powerfully and less efficiently in thicker atmosphere, and the atmosphere at sea level on Eve is remarkably oppressive. For this reason, a particular mountain has been chosen as our landing spot. We are going to aim our descent by first waiting for the planet to rotate underneath our orbit until this mountain is directly underneath our orbit, and then when doing the descent itself, facing the nose of the craft either to radial or prograde to control the drag during the first parts of the descent. Once we go below an altitude of 75 kilometers, the die is cast. We now need to face directly prograde so none of the parts escape the protection of the heat shield. Once we've descended to an altitude of 25 kilometers, we've slowed sufficiently such that we can dispense with the heat shield and now fully control the rest of our flight to the surface of Eve. The mountain we are aiming for features a narrow but fairly long and flat ridge at the top. Therefore, right before we land, we're going to turn to the south to fly with the direction of this ridge and have a better shot at a safe landing. The relatively high stall speed of this design, combined with the intense gravity of Eve, made this a very difficult landing. After a successful landing, our usable mass remaining, counting the 2 modules left in low Eve and low Kerbin orbit, is at 9 tons, 974 kilograms. Bill takes a short walk over to the true summit at the highest point of the ridge. Looks can be a bit deceiving here. There's a couple points that look higher. I did test them all out. This one is a couple meters higher than the rest. It wouldn't be a flag and footprints mission without a flag, so we're going to quickly put down a monument so people will know we were here. We've borrowed a method from kneeling buses to get Bill back in, and it's time to get him home. The first part of our ascent to Eve is actually going to be coasting downhill. There's a low point on the ridge just south of us that'll let us coast without any use of rocket engines over to the other side, and then start picking up speed once we're over the ridge. Coasting to a substantial speed before igniting the rocket engines is to our advantage because of the constant impulse of rocket engines with respect to speed. Since the impulse is constant, and since kinetic energy is a function of the square of velocity, we effectively get more kinetic energy out of each gram of fuel if we're going faster when using the rocket engine. For this reason, trading some gravitational potential energy for kinetic energy before igniting the rocket engines is another free lunch for Bill. Immediately after takeoff, we're going to stage off the landing gear module, which also contains some fuel tanks to get us started, which are now empty. The next stage of this ascent is going to be very steep, a lot steeper than the ascent you saw on Kerbin, and a lot steeper than the ascents you will have seen in other videos on this channel. This steep ascent profile is due to the extremely thick atmosphere on Eve. This thick atmosphere means that trying to go through transonic speeds below an altitude of around 10 kilometers has a totally unacceptable amount of drag. We still, however, do want to get out of the thickest atmosphere of Eve quickly. We can't go faster, so the only answer is steeper. The mass of the Eve orbiter on the surface of Eve was 9,384 kilograms. After depleting the first stage, it is now down to 696 kilograms. This stage uses a twitch engine, and while less powerful than the previous stage, we've now gained enough vertical velocity that we can face prograde and really start picking up airspeed. Another balancing act was present here. We want enough vertical speed to give us time to reach an Eve orbit, but lower is more efficient, so we want just enough vertical speed. After staging the second rocket of the Eve ascent, we are now down to one Spider engine stage with a mass of 280 kilograms, counting the 95 kilograms of Bill. While this third stage has a lot of heart, it unfortunately is not going to be enough to get us into a low Eve orbit. As with the previous low-mass mission, this is where we're going to use the suit itself to finish the maneuver. This was certainly the time in the mission to do this. As we saw previously, the interplanetary maneuvers with the ion engine are extremely efficient. Delta V there isn't that valuable, but Delta V on the Eve ascent is enormously valuable, with any mass savings cascading onto the lower stages and making those lighter as well. Bill, however, might now look a little bit stranded. We need to rendezvous with the module that we left in low Eve orbit, but he only has a sliver of fuel left in his pack, not enough to do the maneuvers necessary to rendezvous. What he also has, though, is a rescue from Robotug, the probe intelligence which has been installed into the module that we left elsewhere in low Eve orbit. Robotug is able to independently perform these maneuvers and would never leave Bill stranded in a dangerous neighborhood. And we are now ready to return to Kerbin. The ion shuttle with Bill in it weighs 602 kilograms, which means that our total usable mass remaining is now at 692 kilograms. The interplanetary transfer from Eve to Kerbin is going to be quite straightforward here. The low mass of Eve's moon, Gilly, means that any potential gravity assist off of it is negligible, so we're just going to do a simple transfer orbit back. While the ion shuttle is now significantly lighter than when we came from Kerbin, the TWR is still low enough that we're going to split the ion burn over many ion burns at periapsis. All of the ion fuel tanks, except for the last one, are staged off when we have just that amount of fuel remaining. As with the capture in Eve orbit on the outgoing part of the mission, the return to Kerbin is going to involve very little aerobraking to capture in Kerbin orbit due to the intense heat model in KSP2. The vast majority of this maneuver is going to be done with a retro burn with the ion engine. A much shorter maneuver this time. It's going to take about 8 minutes and 50 seconds. The maneuver from elliptical Kerbin orbit to low Kerbin orbit is then going to consist of one moon assist and a series of aerobraking passes. Once we get to low Kerbin orbit, we're going to rendezvous with the unpowered Kerbin lander that we left there at the beginning of the mission. Since the Kerbin lander is unpowered, it's important that we keep the ion shuttle module around for now. Bill promises Robotug that this is a safe neighborhood, so we're going to leave Robotug in low Kerbin orbit for now, and Bill gets into the Kerbin lander for the first time. Robotug does have one more bit of assistance to lend in this mission. He pushes Bill into a suborbital trajectory before returning to a low Kerbin orbit. The strange appearance of the Kerbin lander is worth talking about. In terms of both appearance and its collision model, it is an annular ring with the pilot sitting in the middle with no front or back. However, in terms of protecting its contents from both aerodynamic drag and heating, it acts as if it does have a front and a back. It seems the intention here was to use this part within a longer rocket of the same radius, so it does look a bit funny when we just use this part. The doors on the side, which appear quite irrelevant, are then quite useful in controlling how much drag this craft has. We have to keep them closed during the most intense parts of reentry heating, but once we get past that, we're going to be able to open and close them to control our final landing approach. We therefore are going to have full control on the east-west axis of where Bill touches down, but we're not going to have any control on the north-south axis. That is subject to the whims of fate. Testing revealed that there was quite a bit of random drift with this, and we have no way to counteract that. The other requirement for our landing here is that it needs to be in water. We're going to open the doors at the right time here to prevent us from overshooting the coastline by too much, but we do want to make sure we get past the coastline. In order to keep Bill safe during this landing, we're going to keep the doors open to increase drag and slow us down, and then close them at the very last moment before splashing down for protection. That unfortunate explosion on landing brings our mission to an end. Unfortunate, something to give a shot next year. False alarm. Bill tells us that this is a 100% intentional, planned, and controlled fire that ejects the pilot safely into the sea. While Bill insists that he can hold his breath indefinitely, we're going to get him out of this chair and get him back to the surface. The plan then was for a short, invigorating swim back to the coast, and then a walk along the coastline back to the Kerbal Space Center. However, it turns out that Kerbals are a distant cousin of the penguin and travel significantly faster in the water than on land. This was a good chance to get a look at the future site of Kerbal boat program. Boats that very well may come in handy in a future canyon racing challenge when KSP2 gets flight controller support. As Bill finishes the walk back into the Kerbal Space Center, let's look at this challenge, what we did, and how it can be improved in the future. With a launch mass of 27 tons, 972 kilograms, we got Bill from the surface of Kerbin to the surface of Eve, planted a flag, and got him safely home. It would of course be impossible for me to predict all the ways that this could be improved. I can, however, point to particular areas where I think significant improvement is the most likely. The first one that stands out is finding a different way to shield the parts from overheating on Eve. I did try quite a few different kinds of heat shields, but I sense that there's a lot of ways that could be done, and I'm quite certain that I didn't find the absolute best way. A better approach here would both directly reduce the amount of mass needed for the shield, and also could decrease the drag that this incurred on the ascent from Kerbin. You may have noticed that our effective payload ratio to low Kerbin orbit was not particularly good in this mission. That was largely because of the heat shield. The second area I'll mention is in the interplanetary transfers. Since the ion engine is very efficient, this is unlikely to yield as much gain as a better method for shielding, but there's definite room for improvement here. Due to my relative inexperience with using the interface in Kerbal Space Program 2, I deliberately left more margins here than I would have in my missions in Kerbal Space Program 1. As myself and others get more familiarity with Kerbal Space Program 2, I expect to use more precision in how I plan these things out and just budget less fuel for the same maneuvers. The last area that I want to explicitly mention is in the Eve Ascent. I did extensive testing of various Eve Ascent profiles trying to optimize this part of the mission. This is, however, a very complicated maneuver with many steps and many things that can be adjusted in each step. It is therefore impossible to rule out the case that what I found may be a reasonably good local maximum of performance, but there is some absolute maximum of performance that lies with some different ascent profile. This kind of thing happened many times optimizing missions to Eve in KSP1, And sometimes it turned out that there was a very big gap in performance between what I was optimizing towards and what the better path ended up being. There is no substitute here for having other people attempt similar challenging missions and comparing our approaches and comparing the results. And of course, I'm sure that we will find many ways to improve these kinds of missions outside of the categories that I mentioned. In more terrestrial news, I now have a Patreon. This is a way for folks to support the channel while getting early access to videos, updates on work-in-progress content, and all sorts of other perks to make your friends jealous. Go check out the link in the video description. You'll also get a mention at the end of videos, such as right now. Thank you everyone very much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you in the next one.